Hey guys, welcome back to Based MMA. In this video, I'm going to be talking about UFC 300 and why I believe that the main event for UFC 300 is not looking so great, guys. It's not looking so great. And if you guys actually think about it, UFC 300 is not that far away. And we kind of already know the main events for the pay-per-views before UFC 300. I mean, we know that obviously UFC 296 is the next pay-per-view. That is Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington. Then at UFC 297, we have Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis. At UFC 298, we have Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilya Topuria. And then early March, we have Sean O'Malley versus Chito Vera 2. So when discussing the potential main events for UFC 300, I mean, we know that the flyweight division, the flyweight will not be the main event for UFC 300. It doesn't matter how big, just the flyweight. They rarely, I believe, when was the last time that a flyweight title fight headlined a pay-per-view? And I doubt that the UFC is going to make Pantoja or Royval be the main event for UFC 300. They might be on the card as one of the title fights, but I doubt that that any flyweight title fight is going to be the main event for UFC 300. So we're eliminating that fight right there. And actually, before I even start talking about the title fights, the reason that I think it's in trouble is because we were all kind of thinking the Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler was most likely going to be the main event for UFC 300, right? And we know, okay, if Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler are the main event of UFC 300, that's big enough in terms of pay-per-view for it to be a great card, especially if they really stack the cards. They don't have to be the biggest fights. They don't have to be the biggest title fights, but just with Conor McGregor's return versus Michael Chandler, a fight that we've been anticipating for a year now, even though personally I'm not too excited for because, I don't think Conor McGregor's in his prime, but let's be real, Conor McGregor is still the biggest star in the UFC. So the fact that Conor McGregor is not going to be the main event of UFC 300, that's kind of worrisome, right? So it seems like Conor McGregor isn't going to come back until summer. I'm not too sure why he can't fight in April. I'm not too sure why, but that's what it seems like. So it's looking likely now that Conor McGregor will not be the main event of UFC 300. So it's going to have to be a title fight. The main event for UFC 300 is going to have to be a title fight, and there's probably going to be about, I would say, 3 title fights. There's probably going to be a woman title fight in one of those. So I say 2 men title fights and then a woman title fight. But these fights have to be good, man. They just can't be any type of title fight, in my opinion. And look, the flyweight is not going to be the main event for UFC 300. Obviously, it's not going to be the bantamweight title either because Sean O'Malley is fighting a month prior against Chito Vera. So we know, okay, that kind of eliminates Sean O'Malley from being in UFC 300. And also, it also eliminates the featherweight belt as well because we know that Volkanovski versus Ilya Topuria takes place in February. They're most likely not going to have a quick turnaround and fight in April unless, one of them gets a first round KO. Then maybe I could see, Volkanovski or Topuria fighting at UFC 300. But I don't think that's going to end up happening. So I don't think either of those guys are going to fight at UFC 300 or be the main event. So that kind of removes the featherweight title. It removes the bantamweight title. So then we move on to the lightweight title, right? So originally I thought Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira too. I mean, that kind of makes sense for UFC 300. But it seems like, Islam wants to fight in March or in May. I don't know why he doesn't want to fight in April. I don't know if for religious reason, Ramadan, something like that. It seems like Islam Makhachev and Charles Oliveira most likely will not fight until May or June. So it seems like, okay, so then Charles and Islam are out. You know what I'm saying? So the lightweight title isn't going to be for UFC 300. And now we move on to the welterweight division. And I think this is where it gets a little bit interesting because we know that Colby Covington is going to fight Leon Edwards at UFC 296. And I do think that the winner of this fight can potentially fight at UFC 300. The problem that I have is that, for example, if Leon Edwards wins and he fights, let's say, Bilal Muhammad, that's not a big enough fight for it to headline a UFC 300. It could be one of the title fights if there's like a heavier, like a middleweight title fight or a light heavyweight title fight or a heavyweight title fight, then that. But if Leon wins, Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad fight, it's just not big enough. It's not big enough to be the main event of UFC 300. So I kind of eliminate that one. Now, if Colby Covington wins and, Colby, really pushes the UFC to make that Islam fight, I do believe that Colby Covington versus Islam Makhachev could be a big enough fight with a really great main card, which I think it's gonna be one of the most stacked cards ever, regardless of what the main event is. I think Colby Covington versus Islam Makhachev could be a big enough fight for it to main event at UFC 300, or if not, be the co-main event. But that would be a huge fight. Now let's move on to the middleweight division, because I think there's actually gonna either be a middleweight title that's going to be the main event, or a heavyweight title fight that's going to be the main event for UFC 300. Now, we know that Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis is going to take place in January, right? So the winner of that fight, I could see fighting Khamzat Chimaev at UFC 300. I think that would be a massive fight. I think if Strickland wins, I don't know. I mean, I feel like Dricus is getting up there in popularity. Maybe not as much as Strickland, but I think if Strickland ends up winning, Strickland versus Khamzat Chimaev could headline a UFC 300 with maybe like a co-main event of Colby Covington versus Islam Makhachev, or maybe you could even make Colby Covington versus Bilal Muhammad and then just kind of stack the card. I could see that happening. The problem that I have with that is that, like I said, I don't know if those fights are big enough necessarily. And when I mean that, I don't mean that like it's a lame fight whatsoever, but I think for UFC 300, I think the UFC wants to go, big. They really want to go massive. That's why I think they wanted Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, and then maybe put some title fights. And I think, even if it's a higher, because the UFC typically puts the heavier title fights at the top of the card, I think they would make an exception for Conor McGregor because he's such a big star. And I think champions would be like, yeah, I don't care if I'm under Conor McGregor in the card, because a lot of people are going to be watching. So the fact that Conor McGregor isn't fighting at UFC 300, even though personally I don't care too much about the fight, I think it is a big hit for UFC 300 in my opinion in terms of pay-per-view sales. Now, I think this is what the UFC should go for. I forgot to mention the light heavyweight division. I think Pereira versus Hill would be an incredible fight for UFC 300. The reason why I'm not necessarily considering it to be the main event of UFC 300 is because Jamal Hill has come out and said that he will not be ready to fight until May. He will not be, he's still recovering from his Achilles injury. So I don't think Hill's going to be ready. So I think Pereira versus Hill is most likely going to take place sometime in June or maybe May. So that kind of eliminates Pereira and Hill from being at UFC 300. So you guys see how once we actually start talking about these potential matchups, we see that the UFC actually doesn't have too many options left for who could headline and be at UFC 300, you know what I'm saying? So that eliminates the light heavyweight division. We've eliminated the featherweight division. We've eliminated the bantamweight division. We've eliminated the flyweight division. And I think we've kind of eliminated the lightweight division, where it seems like Islam doesn't want to fight anytime before May. So that kind of eliminates Islam, the lightweight title. And then, so if anything, it's going to either be between a welterweight title fight, a middleweight title fight, or in my opinion, a potential heavyweight title fight. And this is where I think it could get interesting. I think if if I were the UFC, I would abandon this whole John Jones versus Stipe Miocic, which nobody really wants to see because we know Stipe Miocic is old. And if the UFC really thinks that Stipe is that guy that could challenge John Jones, and they're not just making that fight due to legacy, then make Stipe Miocic versus Tom Aspinall as the main event of UFC 300. Then for the co-main event, you can make Khamzat Chimaev versus Strickland. The third fight on that card, Colby Covington or Leon Edwards versus Bilal. That's the card right there, in my opinion. I think that would be the best case scenario if you don't have a Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. Obviously, you're also going to put some amazing fights on that card. You put a Dustin Poirier versus Gilbert Burns. You put some crazy matchups. I would love for them to do Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway for UFC 300. I think that would be so fitting. So I think that the best case scenario right now for the main event for UFC 300, in my opinion, is Stipe Miocic versus Tom Aspinall. I think a Khamzat Chimaev versus Dricus or Strickland, especially after Khamzat Chimaev's latest performance, I don't know if that's a big enough fight for it to headline UFC 300, in my opinion. And like I said, I don't think Leon or Colby could headline against against Bilal at UFC 300, that could be one of the title fights on the card. I just don't see it being the main event. So that's why I think that the UFC 300 main event is actually in a bit of trouble if we think about it, right? Because like I said, we've already eliminated a lot of other divisions that are going to fight in the months prior to UFC 300. So it kind of like, okay, who really is going to headline UFC 300 if Conor isn't going to headline? We know Sean O'Malley, Volkanovski, definitely not a flyweight title fight is not going to be on the card. It could be on the card, but it's not going to be a main event. And it seems like Islam isn't planning on fighting anytime before May. I'm not too sure why. So that kind of takes away Charles Oliveira versus Islam too, which I think could be a great fight for UFC 300. I would love to see it. So we're really stuck with either the welterweight division, the middleweight division, or the heavyweight division, right? Because like I said, Pereira, Hill's not going to be ready to fight for UFC 300. He said he's most likely going to be ready to fight on May or in the summer. So unless they want to give Pereira somebody else. Now, this is where it does get a little bit interesting. If Israel Adesanya does decide to come back, and Israel Adesanya versus a Hamza Chimaev would make a lot of sense. The problem that I see, the problem that I could see is that if Dricus du Plessis does end up beating Sean Strickland, I could see the UFC giving Israel Adesanya a title fight. I could, especially if Israel Adesanya decides to come back, it would be a massive fight. And I could see the UFC making Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis, even though Israel Adesanya does not deserve a title shot after that performance against Sean Strickland. And in my opinion, should probably fight an Israel Adesanya, which I think that would also be an amazing fight. But I think if Israel Adesanya sees that, Hamza Chimaev is probably going to be next after Strickland and Dricus, I feel like Israel Adesanya would be the type to no, I'll let Hamza fight for the title. And I'll let these guys worry about Hamzat, and then I'll come in. I feel like Israel Adesanya is going to wait for the right opportunity to come back. I don't really think he's going to wait. I don't think he's going to be off for many years like he was talking about, like 4 or 5 years. I think that's ridiculous. He's probably just waiting on the right opportunity to come back. And I think if the UFC offers him a lot of money and a good matchup, I think, Israel Adesanya is willing to come back to headline UFC 300. And I think, I don't like Israel Adesanya, but he's a big star. He's one of the biggest stars the UFC has. And like I said, there's not a lot of options right now when it comes to who could main event UFC 300 besides Conor McGregor, who we know, like I said, he's most likely not going to be able to fight at UFC 300, which I'm not too sure why. I mean, that would make a lot of sense. I really thought they were going to make Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. Then you could put some big title fights under Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, even though personally, I don't feel like Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler should be the main event. The reality is that Conor McGregor is different, man. He's a huge superstar, and you need him at the top of the card to sell those pay-per-views. And, imagine they put a Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. You put an Israel Adesanya versus Hamza Chimaev. That would also be huge, in my opinion. That would be an incredible UFC 300. And then under that, maybe you put like a Colby Covington or Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad. I think that would be pretty incredible. But yeah, guys, I just kind of wanted to make this video to talk about the potential matchups, more like about the UFC 300 main event. I know the card is going to be super stacked, but I kind of wanted to discuss what the main event could possibly be because like I said, I've already eliminated a lot of options. So guys, please make sure to comment down below what fight you think is going to be the main event for UFC 300, especially now that it seems like Conor McGregor is not going to be the main event for UFC 300. What is the main event that you want to see for UFC 300, guys? Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.